So, hey everybody, it's good to see you. Glad you're with us again this morning. And I am so excited this morning because we have with us Kagan Parker, Daryl Parker's daughter. But many of you remember Kagan when she was singing in the band with Brad and the others. And you might remember just how amazing her voice was. We were so lucky to have had her stumble by and then join in with us. Turns out she's also a singer-songwriter in her own right. And you can go online and probably just search her name, Kagan Parker, and songs, and she's got several new ones
Yes.
that are out now as well. So we know Kagan from that context, and I've known her through her father, Daryl, who was with me in this same capacity here in this setting a couple of months ago. But Kagan has also been involved more recently with our Crafting Difficult Conversations on Monday nights. And it really has, she's been such a great addition in terms of just insights. She's living in Baltimore, has a lot of insights, I think, that we don't really have in our setting here. She brings a lot of that, as well as her young adult understand. I mean, just how she sees things. It provides a fresh light in that group, and it's been really well received. And that's what inspired me to bring her on this morning and have a nice conversation with her about just a number of different things. So we'll probably talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes.
We'll talk about Eartha Kitt. We'll talk about. I'm going to bring up a guy's name, Susha. You don't know Susha,
I
but I'm going to
don't.
bring up Susha. So we're going to have some fun, and we'll see where this conversation goes. Kagan, welcome this morning.
Thank you
Good to
so
have
much.
you.
Thank you.
And I've really been looking forward to this. And can you give us a little insight on how you've experienced this Crafting Difficult Conversations on Monday nights?
Yeah, it was so my dad sent multiple emails and kept inviting me and asking me to come and kind of poke my head in, but I think there was one night I had no homework and was sitting around and was like, "Okay, let me go ahead and poke my head in." And I was really impressed by the conversations that were actually being crafted. You know, you hear some titles of things and you assume it's going to be one thing, but I was surprised to turn out it was actually what the title of the group was. We were building these difficult conversations with a transparency you don't get every day, and it's not something that you encounter in your everyday conversations with neighbors or the guy at the grocery store. So it was very refreshing, and I was immediately sucked in. I can't stay away at this point. I make time for it every Monday with the time difference, and I'm ready and next to my laptop, and
Yeah.
I'm always so excited
It's an
to.
hour ahead there?
It's
Right,
an
so
hour
yeah.
ahead.
Okay,
It's
so
a
8
little
o'clock
thing,
there.
but it's so weird to remember. Like, oh, it's 7 there, it's 8 here, and got to get my stuff over. But it's been really inspiring. The individuals who take their time to join are there to do it. Like, they're there to have the conversation. They're ready to be uncomfortable. They're ready to learn something new, and that's my favorite space, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it started right around the time, not long after George Floyd's murder, and it was so there was a lot of Black Lives Matter. There was a lot of that focus and sort of white fragility and all those topics that are still difficult topics. But it's kind of expanded into, how do we talk about politics?
Yeah.
How do we talk about religion?
Friendships. Yeah.
And approaching friends, and we were talking about this phrase earlier, code switch, which is like, what is that?
I guess the way that I understand code switch is that you have a certain vernacular that you use around particular people. Like in church, we use words like holy, sanctified, things like that, which may not mean anything to the average person outside of the church. So then you switch the way that you speak when you're outside of the church with your normal friends that are normal people that may not be religious or may not share the same religion. So you understand that these words won't translate. And then sometimes you do that thing where you forget to take the switch and flip it. And
Yeah.
you can tell how uncomfortable people get because they're really confused and they may just be polite and do that Texas thing we do where we're like, oh, yeah, for sure. But they have no clue what you're talking about, or they may take offense to it.
Right.
Which I found to be very interesting. Like the word sinful, we talk about it very casually in the church. It's something that we all understand we are, that it's inherent in us, versus saying it to someone who's not religious. It's really offensive. Like sin, anything in my life what's a sin? You get angry because you don't understand what it is.
Yeah.
But it's harmless in our community. So
And this language, it triggers our emotions.
Yes.
And trying to be sensitive in moment. I mean, that's a big part of too what this crafting. We keep coming back to sort of these basic sort of techniques of letting go of expectations, letting go of assumptions, setting those things intentionally aside when we enter into conversations. realizing we already know who's going to trigger us a lot
Yeah.
of times. We sometimes stumble into conversations that we don't know. But when we do know, we just sort of dread them.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about different ways of techniques of letting go of that dread
Yeah.
in order to experience something else. But every time I get into one of these conversations with people here, a big part of it is kind of looking at our roots, religious roots. I always like to ask, what was your upbringing? Can you think of a moment or a story or something that sort of epitomizes your upbringing religiously? Some people don't have a religious story, but
Yeah, which I thought was really weird as well. I didn't realize everybody wasn't born in the church. That seemed normal to me. I was born into the church. I think my dad was Baptist growing up, and so we kind of ended up in the Seventh Day Adventist area. We picked just another denomination to explore, and that was kind of what we did when we were younger. And then I remember most of my religious upbringing being non-denominational, which was hilarious because we would be in a room full of people who did not fundamentally agree, but that were willing to sit in the same room and receive the same message. And it was strange to realize they were all hearing it differently and absorbing it differently. So I think that not having that base area of understanding in the church was really fascinating because I really got to talk to different people and kind of wiggle into their minds and hear how they would hear things. Like you hear the sermon about honoring your husband and honoring your wife. In the Methodist church, that means something different than it does in the Catholic church. So they hear it completely different, take it to heart completely different. So my religious upbringing was very, I'd say, open at home. My dad was always welcoming questions. We were always having Bible studies together, talking and being open. But at church, I kind of was an observer. I never really participated. That wasn't really my thing. I just kind of sat in the back and was like, what's actually going on in here? Because it didn't seem to make sense to everybody, but they were all still doing it. So I had a lot of fun just kind of learning and understanding, but still very much so felt the same obligations every young person does in church to pray and to read my Bible and to make sure I'm following the rules. No boys, no alcohol, stay on the
really
right
stayed on
path.
that, huh?
And I think I
Yeah.
was about 21 or 22 before I started coming to 1111. I went to school out in Abilene, Texas. So that kind of I kept there for a little bit. And then I moved back home because I realized the country was not for me.
Yeah.
So I moved back here with my dad and started going to the University of Texas at Dallas. And that's when I kind of ran into you guys.
So this is a real typical journey that you're describing.
It honestly was really refreshing to not be the only person in the room who didn't know what was going on. When I first got to 1111, I found out very quickly that everybody was learning and everybody was discovering. The people in the band were teaching me about Buddhism. They were teaching me about meditation and yoga.
in the band.
Yes. And we would go to breakfast and it would be like, I'm being educated. Like,
That's
wait,
so
let me
funny.
hold on to my chair. But like would take notes and was totally in it because they had these perspectives that I had just never come across, especially in people of their demographic.
Yeah.
And I think that was the most refreshing thing about it, is it was just so open and they wanted to teach me and they wanted me to learn and expose me to new things, and it was so cool.
So one of the things that really resonated with me as far as you're being involved in this is kind of where you are in this journey, and you shared with me sort of this process of kind of coming to know who you are authentically, and one of the things which I mentioned earlier when I read the text, that this text about Jesus, what he's saying in the Sermon on the Mount in this section, which are the just a series of teachings basically, but they center around finding your treasure. And so that's what resonated with this idea of where do we find our treasure? And then there's this one line in there where your heart is, that's where your treasure will also be. And it contrasts, your treasure in heaven versus your treasure on earth. But what the real contrast is really with generosity versus self-absorption, essentially, or
Sure.
greed, because it was a very inequitable society, culture that they were in, and there was a lot of poverty and a lot of oppressiveness, and so there was a contrast between those who sought for power and those who were more about empowering one another and sharing. So this idea of finding your most authentic self is true to what I think it means to be a part of the kingdom, and how that resonates then with the greater needs around you. But this was interesting to me because you moved to Baltimore.
Yes.
And I thought that was curious, why you left Fort Worth and went to Baltimore.
It really was a hilarious decision. My mother moved up there after my parents separated, and I had visited twice. experienced what it was like to get lost in DC, kind of hung out in the area, got lost in the forest. I love to hike. And I just kind of felt relieved in a weird way because I didn't stand out. Nothing about me looked funny. Here, I look funny, and I'm okay with that. But I stand out. I'm very tall. I have really short hair. It's colored. I have piercings and tattoos and things like that. So it isn't the norm here, especially in my little suburban area back at where my dad lives. So and I felt it in college too. Like when I was in my classes, I didn't really see anybody who looked like me or have any of the same interests. And when I went to visit there, it just kind of felt like, so what? Like, so what that you look a little different? So what that you have different interests? And that was so refreshing.
So what have you learned? I mean, what has been some of the insight? And I'm guessing you've kind of come up with some comparisons, from your former reality to the current reality that you're in, especially this time that we're in.
Yeah.
So what's been some of that insight, if you don't mind sharing?
That suffering is normal. I think that was something that really kind of stuck with me whenever I moved outside of the church. There was a lot of why me and God's doing this for you if it was suffering or something bad was happening. But when I went overseas, particularly in Prague, they taught me a lot about the Soviet Union and how things were when they were under Russia rule. And suffering is everywhere. And it's very normal. And it's not to be questioned. It's to be dealt with and to talk about and to be open about. They were so honest with their pain and very honest about their process and what it was that they were feeling. And I felt the same thing when I went to Germany. I got to visit a couple of like concentration camps and they just wanted to talk about it. We have to talk about it. And that was compared to my experience in church and then compared to American culture where we're willing to shove everything under the table and we don't want to talk about it. And if we ignore it, maybe it'll get better. That was just profound to me because I got comfortable with hurting and I got comfortable with not being perfect and got comfortable in a state of change because I feel like a lot of times we find ourselves like scratching at the wall when we're in a place of transition because it's not perfect.
You mentioned something to me, I don't remember the podcast, but it was a Buddhist podcast that you'd been listening to.
Yes.
And something you pulled from that's been inspiring and encouraging to you. What was that?
It is, I guess it's a modern take on Buddhism. It's a podcast written by or kind of directed by Noah Rasheta. And he's I kind of like a lifelong Buddhist. He kind of found himself in the faith and in the practices, but it really is about mindfulness. And it was the idea of perpetual okayness that I had offered to you.
Okayness.
And that was also kind of revolutionary. Just as an anxious person, I have found myself kind of like anxious. I feel like there's a lot of people who deal with anxiety, but we don't really know how to deal with it. And mindfulness really allowed me to take control in a way that I had never been able to establish myself before. And the idea of perpetual okayness kind of allowed me to just be okay and be okay with being okay. And it sounds repetitive, but to somebody who's having like tiny panic attacks throughout the day, being able to like put both feet on the floor and stand there for a second and breathe and be like, no, I'm okay.
Yeah.
No, this isn't great. No, what I'm going through is not fantastic and I'm uncomfortable, but I'm okay and I'm going to be okay. That was crazy to me because I could then do confrontation. I can now do situations like this on camera in front of people. My performing changed because even when I was anxious and up on stage and forgetting my words and my bass player
Allows
just
you to
dropped
let
it.
go of that anxiety.
Yes, you just kind of let it all go. And I still have to remind myself it's not perfect yet. It's still very much so a meditation that I have to do every day, but it was revolutionary.
And that so fits with the text that we read today, because the text was, you look at the flowers of the field, the lilies of the field, look at the grass, look at the birds of the air. And of course, it's a very dualistic way in which they're understanding it in first century, which is, God takes care of them. But the reality is it's okay.
That's okay.
It's okay. And the way that Paul Tillich, and I drill this in almost every Sunday, but the way the theologian Paul Tillich spoke about it when he understands that the very ground of our reality is this okayness, is this larger reality than we get caught in sometimes. We get stuck in thinking about it so narrow-mindedly or myopically. It's bigger than us, and we're participating in it. It's going to be okay, and we're okay at the moment. But it's this idea of accepting your acceptance.
Yes.
That's what Paul Tillich said. The hardest thing for us really is that we don't accept our acceptance. And that assumes that we accept others' acceptance too. that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And so it's this larger community, this larger family within the Christian tradition, the larger family of God. Within the Buddhist tradition, it's really kind of almost the larger family of suffering,
Yeah. We're
that we're all suffering.
all suffering together. Life is suffering. But if you stay at this level of okay, nothing's ever really wrong. And it's all going the way it's supposed to go. And I think that was a really cool realization because I'd heard the sentiments echoed in Christian faith, but the language didn't quite click for me. And I think that's something that a lot of people are afraid of when it comes to exploring different religions. They're afraid they're going to get sucked into it, but the ideas are all the same. They all kind of are echoed through this idea of grace and God's ever umbrelling like forgiveness. That's perpetual okayness. I'm going to be all right. No matter what happens, it's going to be just fine. It's the same idea. I just had to hear it in a different way, which was so cool for me.
And people sometimes have trouble with Buddhism. I don't think we do with 1111. I mean, we're a very open-minded and curious community of faith. But one of the things that Buddhism offers is this pragmatic way of practicing this level of letting go, of recognizing suffering but not being attached to it, and recognizing the ground of our, in Christian theology, we might term it the ground of our being as God, and forgiveness as this perpetual reality that we are always accepted. So we just have to learn to deal with it ourselves. We have to accept ourselves. So there's the text also, one of the texts that I read is you can't deal with the splinter in your brother or sister's eye or in someone else's eye, without really dealing with the log that's in your own.
The whole log.
Right? I mean, that's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
I really got to deal with my own okayness.
Yeah.
And while we recognize that, because I said we are going to get to Maslow, and while we recognize that, the image, Maslow's pyramid's coming up while we're talking, but it speaks the very basic needs all the way up to, I think I've got it here on the phone. It goes all the way up, the very basic things: food, breathing, just sustenance and surviving. And then, of course, there's security for me, for my family, for my body. And then we look for ties, connection, family and friendships, relationships. And then, of course, we move from that into a greater sense of our own motivation for self-achievement and self-esteem. And then we reach the higher levels, what he calls self-actualization. And I think what Richard Rohr would say is he would probably call that the second level spirituality, which often sometimes takes a break in our life to begin to take apart the superficial stuff, the sort of concrete ways of seeing things, in order to realize it's more mysterious. And that's okay. We just become more open and embracing. But here's the thing. I learned that in psychology. You've learned that through your psych courses, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that can't get past the first level.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
and a lot of it can be racial as well.
Yeah.
That we just don't understand how different that is for us from our perspective.
I didn't get it either. I feel like it makes everybody feel okay if it's not particular to one person, this thought process. I didn't get it. I grew up middle class, Southern Texas. I lived in this little utopia. I didn't get it. I had no idea. When I heard people were on welfare, it made me kind of, like, why do you need help from the government? Like, I don't really get that. Like, and that was my own ignorance, of course. And it's interesting because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
But then when I saw the world for what it really was, what happened when I moved to, so I live in DC, like Baltimore area, DC, it all kind of, if you've ever been, it all kind of runs together. The metro will take you from one side to the other.
Right.
So being there was fascinating and a huge slap in the face, because there are systems in place in our world that keep you from succeeding. We have this idea that if you work hard, every American can get where they want to be. And that's a lie. It's a blatant lie. That's not true. I've met people in their 40s who have never had a government issued ID. And that's like mind-boggling, but do you know what kind of things you don't have access to without a government ID here? Most things. You can't apply for public assistance. You really can't even go so far as to get some things because you can't even prove you're of age. So like it was like it honestly just ruined everything for me because I thought everything was okay for everyone, and that the choices that we made led to where we ended up in life.
Right.
But that's not
That's
true.
not the case.
That's not
That's
the
just
case
not
at
the
all. And I
case.
got so angry.
Which is the reality of Jesus' time too. It
Yes.
wasn't the case, and this whole process of self-actualization, as far as an act of faith, it has as much to do with being aware of the wider community around us, and also our place in that. I mean, I've heard it called the long view of history. The way that indigenous nations in America have done, Native American nations have thought of this as what's called the 7 generations, where we realize, we begin to look back at the 3 generations prior to us, and how we're a part of that. We're a product of those generations, whether or not we've really explored that.
Yeah. Or accepted it.
But for some of us, like for yourself, Daryl once shared with me the conversation that he's had with his kids, and anyone who's African American or perhaps a person of color would recognize what that means.
Yeah.
For me, it's telling my kids about their first sex talk.
Sure.
For you, it's the first survival talk. I mean,
Yeah.
how old were you when he talked to you about that?
Oh, I was really young. And I hate to say it, but you're really young when you get the talk because we as people of color aren't seen as young and innocent. So we don't really get that whole childhood glossiness that some Caucasian kids do. Like, oh, they're just making mistakes. We don't get that. There's no a second chance kind of thing. So like if you get caught at a young age, you're going to juvie. Juvie is full of children of color because they're automatically assumed to be aggressive. They're automatically assumed to have these malicious intents. So we learned from a really young age. And I think that's another reason why I ended up being that afraid of consequences, is because I knew they were going to be greater for me than they were going to be for someone else. Because I went to school with lots of kids who drank and did stuff like that. And if I got caught, would be different than when they got caught. So I think I was honestly maybe in middle school.
So the basics of the conversation is how you're aware of yourself, where you are at all times, and just avoiding those situations where you would have to be pulled over.
Yeah. Not even pulled over. Don't be too loud. And genuine. Like, don't be too loud in public.
Settings.
Yeah. Don't draw attention to yourself. Say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. Like, say yes or no, sir. At all times, maintain eye contact so you don't seem threatening. Like, speak in a nice voice kind of thing. It's the little things. It genuinely is the smallest of things. Making sure I shook people's hands and was polite. And I kind of, growing up, really thought these were Southern manners. But as I got older, I was like, wait. These people over here are not doing what I'm doing, but I know I have to keep doing it for some reason. And as I got older and things like that, I kind of realized why. But it was really small things, like making sure that you cross the street, like in the lines and not outside of the lines. Because some people don't care about hitting Black people if they're in the street. And that's an actual thing that I've learned. In D.C. especially, you see people get hit by cars all the time and it's casual. And I was like, that was a homeless man in the middle of the street and you just hit him with a car. And I, called the ambulance, and the ambulance guy was like, unfortunately, this is normal.
Oh my gosh. And
I had never even thought about that. But it's the smallest. The smallest of things will keep you alive. I think there was the Sandra Bland case. She didn't want to put out her cigarette. And that started the altercation. He was frustrated that she didn't want to comply with something that she was already doing. I was smoking before you got here. And that's, I was taught to put it out immediately. If you had anything going on, put your phone down, put everything away, turn the music down. If you get pulled over, like hands on the wheel, have your ID out already. It was a routine. Like you had to have this down. And to this day, I still get anxious when I get pulled over and have all those things out and ready because I know you have to.
So a couple of things, because we're kind of running out of time here, and I want to make sure that everybody knows about Tahari Jackson, who is this person that I was reading with regard to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what we've been talking about. And you really need to check out her website. Just Google Tahari Jackson, Tahare Jackson, and then Maslow's hierarchy, and Black Lives Matter. I mean, if you really want to fine tune it, there's so much insight into this inequity that a lot of us are aware of. But what I really love about her website is she also, and she just did this in September, this last September, so it's very relevant, very fresh. She also provides a lot of great ideas for next steps, right? And we just don't end it with our insight and awareness and like, isn't that curious? But really things we can do to begin to live in this community.
Yeah.
That's a faith community, this community of God, or we call it the kingdom of God, or we call it the kingdom of suffering,
Yes.
right? But it's all the same place. It's all that same um, uh, radical okayness.
Yeah.
But we have to share that together. We really have to reach out. So I hope. We'll continue this. You'll continue with me.
Yes.
And we'll have a conversation. We'll do this again. Pick it up next week. We have so much to talk about. Eartha Kitt
Yes.
and critical race theory.
Yes.
And how does all this fit in with the Sermon on the Mount?
Yes.
I mean, just a whole lot. And have you found yourself yet?
Working on it.
So we need to do that. I'm going to end with a little quote because it speaks to something you said earlier. It's by a woman named Catherine Mansfield, who works with Oxford University, I believe. But she has this wonderful phrase. She deals with spirituality and mysticism, and she has this great phrase that spoke to something you said earlier. Everything in life that we really accept undergoes a change. So suffering becomes love. This is mystery, and this is what I must do.
Oh, wow. I like that. I like that a lot.
Thought you would.
Yeah.
So everyone, good to be with you, and so good to have you with us, Kagan, and she'll be back with us next week to talk some more in depth with what we're dealing with here. And Brad's going to bring up a song, The Crowded Table. They do a great version of that. Blessings, and we'll see you next week. Thanks again.